CWPA Remote.
Hi, I'm Ed Hawes, Director of Communications for the Collegiate Water Polo Association, and this is CWPA Remote. Joining us today is a man who stepped right into the coaching ranks almost as soon as he finished up college. St. Francis College Brooklyn head coach, Bora Dimitrov. Nice to have you with us today.
Absolutely. Pleasure to be with you, Ed, and thanks so much for the opportunity to speak a little bit about the current situation.
Oh, no. Why don't you talk a little bit about how you got into water polo and what brought you to St. Francis?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you know, some of folks watching this may know, I grew up in Serbia, came to the United States for my college career of a student athlete. So my first destination was Diablo Valley College, which was the junior college in California for our first 2 years. And in my first year, we actually reached the state's final, which was a big success. And, you know, rule of the thumb was at that time that a lot of international athletes, especially in water polo, were transitioning to the East Coast after 2 years in that league over there. So I was lucky enough to be selected by San Francis as one of the incoming transfer students in the 2014. And I was recruited by Coach Srđan Mihaljević, who was also an alumni of the college, and you know, he was great. I spent 1 year playing under him, and then Coach Igor Zagoriko was the coach who was coaching my senior year, and under who I worked as an assistant coach my first year out of the pool and after graduation. So it was always been my desire, my wish to study in the United States and you know, also be an athlete at the same time. It was a great journey, and who would have said that after the end of it, I'm going to end up, you know, coaching and be on the other side. It was a great, you know, growing and learning experience for me, and I'm very happy to still be in this position and, you know, enabling the same opportunity for many student athletes coming from abroad.
Obviously, because you were so young when you became a head coach, and because you're at your alma mater, you probably had to coach some of your former teammates as a head coach when you stepped into that role, which is probably a very difficult situation because you played with them, you know, interacted with them as a student, and then now you're the head coach and you're a disciplinarian. How'd that experience work for you from going from player to assistant coach to head coach in such a short period of time?
Absolutely. That's a really good question, and I love to answer that question. You know, back home when I was younger, I used to play, you know, for a club that was coached by a player who was the coach at the same time. And so, you know, I kind of picked up a lot from that because I realized that, you know, I worked with someone who was put in that position, and there was a lot of experience, and I also used that person as my mentor going into my coaching career at San Francis College. Mm-hmm. So, you know, thanks to that mentorship and guidance, it was a little bit easier transition for me. But also thanks to the coaches at San Francis College who saw a potential leader in me in the pool while I was still a player, and selected me for the captain of those teams. It was already a certain relationship established between the teammates and myself. So the transition, which also made the transition itself a little bit easier for me. So those two things are the major reasons why, you know, the transition for me personally was a little bit easier. Although usually it takes a little bit of time. So it did definitely took a lot of time, you know, for me to adjust. And, you know, I can only thank the coaches from the other teams, you know, the conference in which we play, Northeast Conference, for being supportive and being patient with me and allowing me the chance to grow by working with them and playing against them. So it was a lot of support in place for me as I was coming, and I'm really grateful for that.
All right. Obviously, you yourself were an international student coming to the U.S., getting that experience of playing in a different cultural situation, first at Diablo Valley and then at St. Francis. How do you approach recruiting internationally and recruiting, you know, within the United States? Is there a difference in the recruiting process? Is it the same process? And if you're an international student looking to play in the U.S., what advice would you give someone who's looking to come to the U.S. to play, be it from Serbia or another country?
Absolutely. Another very good question. So when it comes to domestic recruitment, as I was coming on St. Francis College, it was extremely international, with a very few student athletes coming from actually domestic end.
Mhm.
So what my idea was, as soon as I assumed the head coaching position, was to always have the largest number of the American players in the team. So we always have a core or 6 to 7 Americans in the team, and then we build on top of that. So that was my big desire. So recruiting domestically, we having difficulties to compete with the recruitment of the schools we're playing against in our conference. Given the size and the tradition of those schools, so we generally tend to look less in direction of California. We go to Florida, we go to Texas, we go to PA. Those are some of the places we recruit from domestic students. Although we are looking to grow our recruitment efforts in California definitely, and see if we can get a potentially higher number from students there. You probably know William Lapkin, who was the modern day alumni who came to St. Francis College and who was one of our best players. So, we are trying to leverage that, and we're trying to tap into California a little bit more when it comes to recruiting. But it's a true pleasure recruiting domestic students because you actually get to see them, through the camps and different opportunities to see them playing. So it's really exciting to see where they are, which level, and then you have a clear idea about what kind of player you're bringing, and which are the good sides, bad sides, and what's the best way to attack that and tackle and approach those players. When it comes to the international, I think all the coaches would agree that unless you get to see them in person, which is a very rare thing to do, you're basically taking a little bit of a chance there. But as long as you pick up good recommendations, from coaches previously coached the player, or if the player actually played for the national team, it's a little bit easier. The scouting process is a little bit easier, and then the videos will do it for the coaches. In terms of what I would recommend international, student athletes, water polo players coming to the United States, I think for me, I was always interested in seeing how much of due diligence they actually do before coming to the United States, or before they start with their recruitment process. There's a lot of student athletes coming from overseas. They're not very familiar with the way of they need to conduct themselves through the recruiting process. And I think the first impression is a very, long-lasting impression. So as long as I see in a recruit that they know about the school, they know about the environment, and they see themselves as a fit, you fit into in that environment, I'm becoming more and more interested, and I'm putting the water polo skills in the second plan and in that particular situation. Of course, they're very important, but I also want to see the responsibility. I want to see that the student is constantly communicating with me, asking questions, and making sure that we are covering all the gaps in the recruitment process. So I'm very, very, focused on that type of students. And I think other coaches would like to see that as well. They like good communication, because that communication is established prior to student athletes coming and going through the onboarding process is going to be, very, very important. In establishing the further connection, communication, and establishing the leaders in some of these players that usually become some of the best players on our teams.
All right. In terms of recruiting to St. Francis, obviously you're in Brooklyn, New York, so you're sitting in New York City. What advantages does being in New York City offer you from a recruiting standpoint, but also what advantages does that offer to a student who's looking, be it international or domestic, looking to compete on the varsity level in water polo?
Yeah, absolutely. So, in terms of just arriving to New York, and I'll give you, in my personal example, the breakdown between California and New York, and what was a little bit of a cultural shock for me going to California, and then from California to New York. It was because going from Serbia to California was a really, a big surprise for me, and getting adjusted to a completely different system, not only in terms of life, but also in terms of practices and how they're being conducted, the coaching styles, and everything else. But then going from California to New York was a completely different thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I think what helped me in New York is the internship opportunity, because most of the international student athletes coming to USA are kind of aware of this perspective that they are not going to be professional athletes. They're not going to pursue the professional athlete career, although there are exceptions in water polo. But for the most part, the highest percentage, goes into the professional careers in field of business, economics, and some other whatever field they choose. So essentially, I think the internship opportunity for me and growing, in the professional arena while still attending college was a really important factor for me. And hence, I ended up being in New York. And I think for most students coming to St. Francis College, they are looking for the same opportunity. So given that the city is connected with subway, and then you can be just about anywhere in less than 45 minutes, was very, very, appealing to me. And going from California, where I needed a car, which was additional expense, driving to San Francisco, that was 45 minutes away. It was never easy, especially when you get jammed in the traffic. And with practices and school, combining all three together didn't seem realistic. But as soon as I came to New York, it was a little bit different story. And I was able to get, from school to my internship in less than 20 minutes. And it became much more doable for me. And I think that's the number one thing that international student athletes coming to play water polo at St. Francis are looking for.
All right. Being at St. Francis and being in the Northeast Water Polo Conference, you have conference rivals like Iona that are in New York City around you, but you also have Harvard and Princeton and Brown, which are a little further away. And of course, you have Fordham, which is in the Mid-Atlantic Water Polo Conference. This is across town in the Bronx. Does being one of three varsity programs, and also Wagner College out in Staten Island. So being one of those varsity programs, is there, what's the competition like against those other schools? Some of you see in conference play, some you do not. You might see an invite, or you might cross over in a non-conference game at home. What's that like being in the New York metro area and having those New York schools so close around you? Do you face any rivalry with those guys, or is it all pretty cordial for the most part?
Yeah, so when we used to play with Fordham, those games were very intense when we were in the same conference. And even now, we like to book a game just before our conference championship. So 2 weeks before conference championships, we always play with Fordham, and those games are pretty intense. So there is certainly a certain level of rivalry there. But I would say the most interesting games are definitely with Iona, their pool and our pool, especially when we go to their pool, because they get a lot of fans. It's a real New York rivalry between us and them. So it's great to be a part of those sports moments and events, because you truly see the size of the rivalry between the two schools. With Wagner, we didn't really get much playing time at their pool. Neither did they get it on us on our pool. So there was not a rivalry established, but I'm sure that will be another rivalry that will be very, very good and interesting to be a part of. But going forward, for us historically, always the biggest rivals were the Ivy League schools, and that was something that we were always the most passionate about, and just the opportunity for St. Francis College to host Harvard, Brown, and Princeton in our pool throughout our conference, games throughout the season is amazing. And there is a good number of folks in our school very much interested to come and watch those games, because it's not every day that you're hosting one of the big schools. So that's definitely where the biggest passion for my athletes, myself, and I believe the athletics department lies. Are us being able to host those teams and getting a chance to sometimes win is very exciting, and definitely something that always makes us work harder and want that more.
Well, I'll ask one final question. I always like to end these things with the same question. You've been in this now for a couple of years as a head coach. Obviously, you were a player. You were an assistant coach. What's one piece of advice, if you could look back when you started as a head coach, something that you know now that you wish you had known then when you started out, that may have changed how you approached the job and how you approached, handling a team of 18 to 22 plus year old guys, and all the struggles that may come up with dealing with a men's varsity water polo team and just dealing with the team in general. So what would that one piece of advice be if you could look back and change something or give yourself a piece of advice?
Absolutely. So it's another very, very good question, because coaching the environment of students coming from all over the place, is where they've been coached on different under different systems, under different coaches, and now they're coming to be coached, all together under one coach who has the system. My one advice that I would give to myself back then would be to be more flexible, and to be more patient in giving them time to adjust to the new conditions and terms under which they're practicing, and also living, going to school every day, going to practice. So I would say a little bit too strict when I first started, because I wanted to create that system and put a system in place very early in my coaching career. And I feel that I was creating a lot of pressure back then. But you learn as you go. So I learned how to release that pressure, and I learned how to give them space to breathe, and then give them time to get more adjusted and understand how the process works in the U.S. and water polo in general. So that's definitely something that I would to tell I would have told myself back in the day.
All right. Coach, thank you for doing this. We appreciate it, and best of luck this season.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ed, and appreciate the opportunity to share.
Thank you.